If a person came to you saying they wanted to give up all their mundane worldly activities to focus on the spiritual life, how would you respond to them?
Good for you.
What about eating, feeding the body?
Well,
I mean, how much do you really want to give up?
Nevertheless, it's a good sign. It may be impractical. There's a lot to be said for giving up worldly activities. One tends to look at this question in very high contrast and absolute form, as if that meant one was going to live on a mountaintop alone forever, or enter a monastic order or something like that. It doesn't necessarily need to be the answer to this question. This is really the root of vacation and pilgrimage and the desire for things to be different by breaking with the way things are.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's a common thought for people beginning in their spiritual life, and it indicates just how strong their desire is.
Well, not only how strong their desire is, but what kind of temperament they have. Because a little isolation is good for some people. Some people really take to it, and others can only take so much of it.
Yeah.
And again, your mileage may vary.
Right. Well, you might ask if they're willing to give up the one who lives in the world.
Yes, well, they didn't even have to give up the world.
That's right. Cut to the root.
Yes. Let's have another voice here.
We could, of course. One thing I said last time was I had that impulse when I first got initiated. And I just thought the ideal thing would be if I didn't have to do anything else except invoke in the Zawiya.
Maybe you could ask them a question. Is maybe the better thing to be asking not whether I should give up all worldly activities to focus on the spiritual life, but how can I sanctify all my worldly activities so that all my worldly activities become part of my spiritual life?
Right. That's not bad.
That finally is a better solution. Most people have to get to that solution by doing something else first, like giving up their worldly life, before they come back to it.
Yeah, a similar question would be, if you were actually living a spiritual life, would the world be a problem?
Well said.
And by continuing your spiritual path while still at least having a foot in the world, you have that point of reference about how seriously you take the world. Give you some indication that you're either becoming cynical or spiritual.
Yes, that's a good point for introspection.
That's all I've got.
All right, so the next one is, I was reading one of Wendell Berry's essays where he is explaining Ezra Pound's Make It New slogan as meaning not that we should idolize new things, but that we must reinvigorate the tradition. I recently visited one of the traditionalist journals, which just came out with a new issue, and it was all stale and moldy, a bunch of stale cream puffs, same old stuff. I feel like what you are trying to do is make it new, namely not to come up with new doctrines or practices, but to reinvigorate the tradition rather than rehashing stagnant and time-bound thoughts. Am I correct in feeling this way? And what would you add?
I think you're correct in feeling that way.
Right.
And there's so much of a balance to be struck between making things fresh and available and understandable, and yet keeping things that are good in the way that can be maintained too.
Well,
tradition has a lot to offer. On the other hand, it can become brittle and stale.
Right. Well, if you are an archaeologist, you might discover just exactly how often when they uncover a temple, it was built on the foundation of a previous, which I thought was a nice analogy or a nice metaphor, that you can't throw out the foundation, you've got to build on something.
Right.
And you used the word fresh, which I think is probably Ezra's intended meaning of making things new. He's not saying look for new things, he's saying make it new. Whatever it is, no matter how old it is.
There's so much great wisdom in tradition that's lost because of an inability or an unwillingness to provide new metaphors and language to express the things.
Right. I mean, you wouldn't recommend every spiritual type, you wouldn't give them all the same spiritual or practical instruction.
No.
And just as in education, they talk about engaging the person on the basis of different intelligences. And so after the world changes a certain amount, you don't have as many foundational points of reference in your worldly life, which means you lose the power of some of the symbols. And, so look at how often we make references to computers or to other things that are part of modern life. And so, I don't know. I mean, it's got to be fresh. It has to engage the person who wants to be interested in the truth.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important. I mean, we can't be elitists here. I mean, I think there's a certain importance and beauty to, let's say, the original form of the Odyssey, but many people can't approach that. So having something in a more modern diction is helpful for them. And a friend of mine who's a college professor decided, I'm just going to wing it one time and use this modern translation where it's the gist of the Odyssey with all the morals and meanings and basic stories, but it's using things like Black Hawk helicopters instead of some of the more ancient implements of war. And the students loved it. And many of them went on to actually read the more traditional forms. And if you started out with the more traditional form, they just would have been bogged down and bored by it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Sometimes you can bring it to life before you even let on what it is. Because I'm sure that was a really excellent way to teach them the Odyssey, those who wanted something from it.
And those ancient stories are so rich and so full of lessons and lessons and lessons.
Yes.
And finally, the Odyssey is about somebody who wants to go home. The world keeps getting in his way.
Speaking of which, that's the next question. What do the classics such as the Odyssey, Divine Comedy, and other such works have to offer us today?
And when Odysseus finally got home, who was the only one who recognized him?
Argus.
Yes, that's right, his dog. Point being, dogs are faithful. Faith knows the truth.
Yeah, you can get that out of it.
Isn't that wonderful?
Well, it is. I hope Penelope recognized him pretty soon after that.
Yes, I think picked on that fairly soon.
Why is that dog wagging his tail so furiously? Oh.
Yes, wonderful story. How are we doing here, folks? Say to Zainab, we haven't heard from you.
Well, I was just going to add, since we're on the topic of tradition, anything without meaning becomes stale. And I think that's where the problem arises when tradition is looked at something ancient without any meaning. But when it's looked at something that has meaning behind its practices or whatever particular tradition that we talk about, then it becomes alive. It doesn't remain stale.
You may need a new image to point to the meaning.
Absolutely.
Behind the symbol that's become a little opaque with unfamiliarity.
Right. And the new language or the new form or the new symbol is all so that one can understand the meaning behind it.
Right. I mean, people write new sacred music all the time, and some of it really is sacred.
That was, in fact, Tolkien's entire point. He's like, the English-speaking people are losing their connection to tradition. There's no hope in really getting them to connect with, let's say, the Celtic tradition. So I'm going to create a new tradition for them and let's get people talking about it. And well, they're still talking about it. So I think it was successful.
Yeah. I didn't read the whole thing. I'm not sure it was ever completed, but the creation of the world through singing, through sound, is the opening of the book, and it's just an incredible creation story.
Which one are we thinking of here?
The Silmarillion.
Oh, yes, yes. The opening paragraph of the Silmarillion is celestial. That's the opening paragraph.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, if you've read any other creation stories, or even the first part of the Old Testament, you can see how it's doing a good job of doing the same thing.
And we touched on this a bit already, but what do classics such as the Odyssey, Iliad, Metamorphosis of Ovid, and Divine Comedy have to offer us today?
Wasn't it our friend Sidi Izzadin who had recently read the Divine Comedy and described it as the ultimate self-help book?
Yes.
I'm a little loath to use that term, but it is spiritual growth. And There are lots of ways to make something real to somebody. If it's really old, if it's a really old story, then it takes effort. But it's been a long time since I looked at the Divine Comedy, but I thought, what an incredible work. It's the Pilgrim's Progress on steroids.
Yes, well, gee, all those great classics have a lot to offer, but as I think we said in the previous question, so often they need to be modified or translated.
Yeah,
that,
interpreted.
They're more available.
Yeah, it's more like interpretation or translation. If somebody wanted to read the writings of, I don't know, go back a few hundred years, reading something that is clearly supposed to be English, it's difficult. And it's because that language is frozen in a point in time, and time has moved on. So it may need to be translated, which requires somebody with a spiritual sense and an artist to do it well. It's like translating between languages. You can't simply know how to translate each word. It has to be translated organically. You have to be able to read it in one world and write it in a slightly or entirely different world, but writing the same thing. So, when they're old, they're difficult works of literature.
But one thing I will say is, some people reject the stuff because it's old and they think it has nothing to offer us. We can all agree that that's wrong, but some other people will come at it from the opposite perspective and be like, oh, it's old, it must be good. Well, it's not good because it's old. It's good because it has something of value to offer, something universal. And I really like how Simone Weil puts it. She's like, if people think that these older periods just cranked out masterpieces, that's just not the case. It's just we only know the masterpieces because all of the junk has fallen by the wayside. History and time has a way of separating the grain from the chaff. So in some sense, looking through classics is simply letting time do the work for you. Because right now, when we have such a glut of material and information to go through, I'm sure there are masterpieces out there. It would just be really hard to find them.
Yeah, time has eroded a lot of the noise.
Yes, it's hard to find modern masterpieces. Do you know I have a new book out?
So I've heard. It hasn't arrived yet. It's supposed to get here on Thursday. I don't know why everything I ordered on Amazon the last time is taking till Thursday.
Anyway, yes, presumably there are modern works being written that have great spiritual and philosophical value. And I guess we won't know until a few hundred years pass and we'll see which ones survive.
Right.
Or it might be that somebody that we encounter, a serious seeker, and they tell us what they've been reading, and we discover, oh, wow, that thing led them to this very good place.
Speaking of a serious seeker, the author of that book really liked the Silmarillion.
Oh, yeah, and the other Inkling.
So part of the problem with this question is, how much current literature do you need to read to see if there are any great classics out there?
Yeah, the number needed to treat.
And where would you
in
start?
medicine? Right.
There's a lot of great classic stuff out there, and I'm just approaching it from the Western perspective because that's what I'm familiar with and that's where my heart is. But people from different traditions, of course, could find their sustenance in works like the Shahnama or Mahabharata, or there are many other beautiful and important classics out there, of course.
Yes.
Anyway, next one. It seems to me that difficult works of literature are especially useful in times such as this, such as the pandemic. Would you agree with this? Is this a time for people to get really involved with difficult works of literature? Let's say Ibn Arabi, or some sort of tafsir of the Quran, or Heidegger, or something difficult. And I'll just elaborate on this by saying that during the war in Bosnia, despite all the problems and the lack of funds and everything, the one thing that was selling like hotcakes was the Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant, simply because it gave people some sort of sustenance, and by concentrating on a difficult piece of literature, it actually helped people in some way. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, for one thing, if you're stuck inside the same four walls all the time, good literature can give you an opportunity to venture out into other worlds, even while you sit there quarantined. And could be a lot more involving and satisfying than just turning on the television and being fed stuff. If you want the gold, you have to dig.
Can I have a question again?
So the question again is simply that it seems to me that difficult works of literature, philosophy, or poetry are useful in times such as a pandemic, because being trapped in four walls, or you need something to concentrate on. And then I said, would you agree with this? Is this a time for people to get really involved with something that's difficult and requires full concentration, something such like an Ibn Arabi, for instance?
Certainly
Sure.
an opportunity.
Well, you can look at the same situation and one person would say it's boredom and the other would say, oh, I'm so free of distractions.
Right.
I can give my attention to things.
Well said.
So we're back to temperament again.
Sure.
All right. Next one. What are your feelings about the Amish and other intentional communities that purposefully forgo the technological apparatus of the modern world?
Well,
It's an understandable impulse.
it's a noble gesture. If really they take that time and separativity and put it to good use, which it seems to be is an essential part of the question. It's one thing to deny yourself modern conveniences or to separate yourself from the mass, but what do you do with that? In and of itself, it's just a thing. Now, if you go back to the last question, if you use that extra time and energy that you save to read the Quran or Ibn Arabi or explore some deep question or work, yes, that's good. But if you find other things to fill up time, the fact that you're avoiding the internal combustion engine, I don't think really gets you much.
Well, no, but if you also don't have radio and TV, then inevitably your time will be filled with more natural things. Take somebody like the Amish, they're craftsmen or farmers, and working the land is pretty darn natural. Helping things grow and harvesting and all that, I mean, it's just really, really natural. And I don't know what the original impulse was, whether it was disgust and rejection, or if they just thought, we found what we need and the world can go on without us.
Yes, that's lovely.
And I think that may be their history, but I'm not sure. That the sect was founded before so much of our modern technology, and they stuck with what they thought was a meaningful life. Not that it doesn't have any problems, of course.
I think that, without, let's say, joining the Amish or even necessarily creating our own communities, though I honestly think that that would be a wonderful thing to do, is to create communities of people where they can basically get back to being homo faber, people that makers, making with hands, art, music, traditional crafts. I think that would be wonderful. I think certainly there could be a community built up around that, based around the ideas of, let's say, E.F. Schumacher, where you have technology, but you evaluate it before you implement new technology, and it's appropriate technology. Small is beautiful, right, he said. But I think it's most important, even if it's not permanent, that for children need to be exposed to nature, because as you said, it's natural. For 20,000 years, people have been engaged in agriculture, and for the entirety of life on this planet, people and all animals have been in nature. It's only been a few decades that people have been sitting sedentary in these small spaces. And I think it's very detrimental to the emotional, physical, and mental well-being of a child to, let's say, have them playing around with the device like a pacifier. And it's my personal, maybe biggest pet peeve, that when I am out and about and I see a 3-year-old kid playing on an iPad or iPhone, I just think it's despicable, because I think that truly does impact the development to their brain.
Well, yeah, it's an invitation to living life with a kind of tunnel vision, whereas the world is broad and full of possibilities that are not two-dimensional.
I believe it was one of the famous Christian philosophers. I forget who it was at the moment. Oh, yes, actually, now I remember who it was. It was Tolstoy. Tolstoy said, the difference between a 5-year-old and me is not that big. But the difference between a newborn and a 5-year-old, it's an unbelievable difference. Much more difference between a newborn and a 5-year-old kid than between a 5-year-old kid and an 80-year-old adult. And I think that that says it very clearly, that for the first 5 years of a child's existence, they should lead as natural of a life as possible and should be exposed to things like languages and nature and not necessarily have these artificial things imposed upon them.
Right. It's just a narrowing of the intellect, and also a certain narrowing of the emotions, in the sense that interacting with a tablet is a kind of instant gratification after instant gratification if you're not using it to design or build something. And I think too early an immersion into that virtual, hence not real reality, I think it's harmful.
All right, good. What are your feelings about the Benedictine option, namely the setting up of zones, communities, monasteries of sorts, where traditional ways may be lived somewhat outside of the hustle and bustle of the modern age?
Well, it sounds good, but what are these traditional ways? Are these the ones we talked about in the first question?
Basically, this option, and it's basically saying that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, to use Sidi Izzadin's term. And during the Middle Ages, when things weren't that great, the monks in the Benedictine monasteries were basically keeping culture alive. And the theory here is that if we set up small communities and live in somewhat traditional ways, what exactly that is, it depends. I mean, according to the authors of this perspective, it would be traditional Catholic, but of course there could be other options that we do that and hopefully create enough communities that if the apocalypse comes of sorts, that some people could keep the flame alive.
Yeah, like the people dwelling in the forest and memorizing books in Fahrenheit 451.
Yes.
I mean, there's a place for it. If there's something of value and you can collectively preserve it and live it to your spiritual advantage, if you can get by with it and it works for you, it's great. Usually the world won't leave you alone.
So how do you decide whether you're really doing it or whether you're just playing at it? I mean, let's get a village and we'll all wear robes and we'll all cook over charcoal and we'll be traditional, right?
Well, traditional.
We'll take some good books and we'll read that. Does that work?
You do make a good point there, Sheikh al-Bashir. I mean, what's the line between doing something serious and beneficial versus being a bunch of SCA LARPers?
Yes.
I don't know those people. Who are they?
People that basically enjoy their weekends by going out and dressing like medieval lords and peasants.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you said SCA. I didn't hear it correctly. Yeah, there are people who do that, and there are people who recreate pioneer days. Some of them also like to reenact the Civil War, but that's a different story.
If you're the Catholic Church, you can probably make this work because you can supply enough either manpower or structure or institutional guidance to be able to set up a Benedict community somewhere, and people can go there and live the Benedictine life. But outside of that metaphor or that particular traditional possibility, what would you do? I mean, to create one of these places.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be a great monastery, you know.
No, but that's the thing the church has to offer. They know how to do monasteries and communities and so forth.
Oh, sure. They've got experience.
If you're outside of that.
Yeah, you have to make it up as you go.
One person that came up with an idea of how to do this is Hakim Bey, also known as Peter Lamborn Wilson, who basically said you come up with a community, you create temporary autonomous zones, and if it works, then it could become a permanent autonomous zone. But the problem with these communities is some of them have done wonderful things, and some of them have been very, very, very beneficial for the people that have been involved, but some of them throughout history, and I've studied these communities, I very often think this community is wonderful. I think all these thousands of communities are wonderful, but all of them at some point, unless there's, as you mentioned, a major organization such as the Catholic Church or another large religious institute behind it, they all tend to descend into petty bickering, squabbling, sex abuse scandals, and all sorts of other things. And then they go the way of the dodo.
There has to be a grand idea behind it that is durable. But people start out and try to form these things when they're idealistic. And at that time, that grand idea seems grand to everybody. But if the grand idea doesn't help people avoid descending into the pettiness, then it'll happen.
What it requires really is leadership, and its success depends entirely upon the quality of that leadership. It isn't going to happen any other way.
Yeah, but a healthy community would appoint good leadership. And if the leadership keeps them healthy, then the next leader may not be a bad person either. Well, I just know that I couldn't start one. I'd never tell anybody to live the way I do.
Yes.
I mean, it seems to work for me, but it just doesn't look like one can generalize it too well.
All right. Question 7, we spent a lot of time on, and that was an interesting question last time.
Would you like to begin with that one next session?
Yeah, let's begin with that one next session. And I think we should also skip question 8 because it's in many respects related to question 7. So let's go on to question 9, the last question from last session, which is, all true Dadas are anti-Dada. Do I discern correctly that the direct path is a bit Dada in the sense that it refuses to be nailed down by any form of conceptualization?
I think that's true. CD?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comparison.
I agree.
They're both iconoclastic in a sense. And any decent spirituality involves some shattering of forms.
Yes, and much of this, what you say, is I think particularly true of the direct path, which has no cosmology and no metaphysics, really no doctrine. And if it has a principle, it only has one, and that would be know thyself.
Yeah, but direct path people still make use of certain concepts and metaphors and things like that. It's just that they tend to point out that none of these things are really it, which is fine.
Right, and you may have to deal with, may even be useful.
Yes, exactly. By dealing with them, you make something that you would have seen otherwise.
Yes, and similarly, from the other side of the same view, direct path doesn't contradict anything.
No, it doesn't.
And it's not against any particular tradition or for any tradition.
Not at all.
No, right. It's for anything that helps.
Or that brings you closer to truth.
Yes, that's a big help. Yeah.
Or helps you examine your experience so you can know yourself.
Well, and you could also say that any form's true value is the process of getting beyond it. It's its highest value because you have to kind of understand it before you can do that.
Yes, that's right.
Now, most of the people, it seems, that are involved with direct path either tend to come at it from a Hindu/Vedanta perspective or a kind of almost secular perspective. And then you are coming at it from the Muslim perspective. But out of curiosity, Sheikh al-Bashir, did you ever have discussions about it with Brother James? And if so, what were his feelings on the direct path? What was his perspective?
He was interested. You may or may not know that James was involved with the Fourth Way.
Yes, I did know that.
So he knew something was missing. He found the Fourth Way. We knew something was missing. We found the direct path. James and I often celebrated that.
Yeah, and I found the Fourth Way too. We both encountered it, but the first thing I did when I realized clearly that something was missing was to return to the Fourth Way and take a second look. And that's when I found a modern version being taught. And it confirmed so many good things. So,
for what it's worth, I have heard more than once Rupert Spira say he is a closet Sufi, or is a Sufi in direct path disguise.
Yeah, something like
His
that.
background was to no small degree Sufism.
Yeah, certainly gained familiarity with it by participating in some fashion.
Yeah, and he has some YouTube videos of readings from Ibn Arabi.
Right.
Before we go, I wanted to ask you, are all of you familiar with Whitman's poem, Persian Lesson?
No, I'm not.
No.
Do you have a minute for, actually, I can send it to you since you have to go, rather than me reciting it.
Okay, and while we were talking, in the last 2 minutes, I received email from Ted about a TED Talk today, which I've not heard, but which I will send to all of you. The title is Why There's No Such Thing as Objective Reality.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah, finally.
Do you know who is it by?
Who is it by? I mean, this guy could be a scientist or whatever. His name is Greg Anderson. In the grand scheme of things, modern reality is a bizarre exception when compared to the worlds of ancient pre-colonial and indigenous civilization where myths ruled and gods roamed. So why do Westerners think they're right about reality? This could be promising.
Yes, it could.